Hi, everybody, and welcome to the State of Title IX Compliance in College Sport. I'm delighted to be able to be presenting to you via Zoom, as it were, and also representing the work and the collaboration that I did with Nick Watanabe from the University of South Carolina. Before I begin, I do just want to mention that I miss Columbia, South Carolina very much. Between the virtual environment and actually being in South Carolina in the springtime, I think that I would prefer to be in South Carolina. But I'm counting my blessings every day that I'm able to join you at least virtually. Um, to get into our material here, I'm going to have a very brief introduction to Title IX, and we're going to give a nod to the fact that Title IX is approaching its 50th anniversary, and that creates a backdrop and a context for the work that we did. I'll talk about the purpose of the study, a little bit about method and analysis, and we'll get into a couple of the findings and then put those within this current context, and then finish up with some conclusions. So for those of you who are familiar with Title IX, it was passed in 1972, and it has, what some people refer to as, these 37 magic words that really speak to sex discrimination and forms of it as being inappropriate in an educational setting. And that we need to be vigilant about not excluding students from participation in activities, not denying them the benefits that go along with those activities. And then also just flat out subjecting them to discrimination that really keeps them from fulfilling their full promise as individuals. So, that's Title IX in a nutshell. And one of the ways in which Title IX has affected the sports system is it's affected the sports system in terms of the number of girls and women who have had the opportunity to participate and to compete. And just to refresh our memories in terms of what that picture looks like over time from 1971-72 to 2018-2019, keeping in mind that these numbers are always like a year behind in terms of reporting, that we've had an increase and an escalation in participation opportunities for girls at the high school level to well over 3 million at this point in time. Just a little interesting sidebar note here. At the high school level, because of COVID and because of the interruption that occurred in the springtime, they felt for the first time in over 50 years that they could not collect data about their participation because of that interruption. In terms of the college level, we say that overall within NCAA participation, we've got numbers that are beginning to approach nearly 500,000 athletes. And we see that female athletes are slowly beginning to catch up with men's sports. And you can see this on screen in terms of 2019-2020 figures. So that's a little bit about kind of sort of the overall look of where we're at the present time. And then, there has historically been kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of experience around addressing gender equity issues and around allowing the full impact of Title IX to play itself out in terms of athletic departments. And so we see here, and these are data that were a part of a report that Nick and I did along with a number of colleagues for the Women's Sports Foundation. But we have a 291% increase in women's sport participation as of 2019. We have over 3 decades, the NCAA has added sponsorship in any number of sports, and you can see here the degree to which those sports have been added. And then in terms of initial sponsorship from 2011 through 2018, the NCAA had added 53 women's beach volleyball programs. All of those are just designed to give you a flavor and a sense for how we've seen women's sport growing, not just in terms of athletic participation, but also in terms of numbers of teams. But along the way, what we've also had is we've had some reversals, some very circuitous ways of coming into compliance. And so over that same 30-year period of time, we've also had some reductions in the number of sports for women as well. So in women's golf, tennis, indoor track and field, cross country, and outdoor track, we've seen cuts that have occurred as well. And you know, when we're looking at points to test out progress, there's been this very interesting juxtaposition between what people actually know about Title IX versus what they claim about what they think is going on in the compliance picture. And work that I've done with Arian Waite, with Erica Zonder, with Brenda Reamer, and also Justin Rodke, who's one of my former doctoral students at Drexel. One of the things that we've seen over time is that there are large gaps in terms of Title IX knowledge across all constituencies associated with athletic departments, from directors of athletics to coaches, to athletes, and to other groups as well. And all of those things are really pointing to kind of a big blinking light around the question of, well, what is really happening in terms of Title IX compliance, and how is that experienced among people who are actually working in athletic departments. And that, in many ways, is part of the snippet of what we're going to be talking about here. I mentioned earlier that that Nick and I had worked on a project for the Women's Sports Foundation, which was published in 2020. And I really want to give a shout out here to all of our colleagues who worked on that project, including Joseph Cooper, Cheryl Cookie, Nancy Lowe, one of Nancy's students, Julie Farr, Sarah Williams, Sarah Cummings, one of my dear students from Ithaca College. We had Karen Isaacson Silver from the Women's Sports Foundation, as well as Marge Snyder from the Women's Sports Foundation, who were incredible collaborators. And then also Erin Bouzavi and Nicole Melton helped us with the shaping of our recommendations. So we really had quite a team working on this very big project. And part of what Nick and I are talking today is one piece of that project. In terms of the overall purpose, design, and method for the overall project, we did a couple of different things, and they sort of sorted out into a phase 1 and a phase 2. The phase 1 dealt with coming up with what I call a compendium of looking extensively at research reports, government reports, as you can see here, 453 review studies, looking at any number of lawsuits that have come out over the past 10 years, dealing with female athletes, alleging all manner of issues associated with their athletic departments in the 3 broad area of Title IX compliance, meaning athletic participation opportunities, athletic scholarship allocation, and then the assessment of operational areas. So we took a look at all of those, and then also media reports as well. So that was really kind of like the first part of this study, and our broad task was to really begin to revisit and to look at both barriers and opportunities that existed for girls and women in sport across the entire spectrum, both in terms of all levels, from youth level through pro, as well as whether or not someone was an athlete participating in a sports system, or whether or not women were working in the sport workplace. So it was a very expansive study. And then along with that, as our second phase, we developed a survey that was distributed across multiple channels that the Women's Sports Foundation Network afforded to us. So we had contacts with national sport governing bodies, with college and university athletic departments, with various youth sport organizations. We had professional sport organizations that we had access to, and then media outlets as well. So all of those were available to us in terms of distributing the survey that we developed. And we need to also acknowledge the work of O'Reilly, Brunei, and Chadish, or Bradish, I'm sorry about that. They had done an outstanding piece of work in terms of looking at the status of girls and women in Canadian sport. And that really was an inspiration for us in terms of the work that we did here. And it initially set the conceptual framework, but our study then really went off in a couple of different directions, largely due to our process of having the survey vetted with 24 people as part of a panel of experts. And that was quite a process as well. And Nick and I can talk with you about the experience of working with such a large panel of experts and kind of managing the feedback that comes in on that. But the end result was that we had 31 questions across 4 different areas, where we were focusing on demographics, barriers and opportunities in terms of sport participation, barriers and opportunities for women in sport leadership, and then open-ended questions as well. So let's say that we had a lot of data, okay, which would be an understatement. And here we go here. My slides are a little sleepy this morning. Now, in terms of kind of what this extravaganza led us to, overall, we had an N of over 2,600 participants in the study. And in terms of racial composition, 88% of our pool was white, 8% was Black, and then we had smaller constituencies in terms of Asians and mixed race. And in terms of Native Americans, we had less than 1% of Native Americans who were participating in this study. The average age was 46 years, and the average term of service for the women's sport leaders of women's sport that were included in the survey, they had worked at their particular role or job for 10 years. I also want to mention that some of the people who participated in the larger study were also volunteers, so that if they served on the board of the USOPC, or if they served on a national sport governing body, for example, they would be in a volunteer role. And we did have a portion of our respondents who were volunteers. But the reason why we wanted to have this particular presentation today, and the reason why we wanted to just spend time on these couple of questions from that larger study, is that, that we actually didn't get a chance to explore these questions specific to the college level as much as we could have in our much larger report. And both Nick and I were really fascinated with the responses that we got to a couple of these questions. And we posed this one question to women sport leaders who were working at the college level. And we asked about Title IX enforcement at the college level, and in their view, how that had changed over a 10-year span of time between 2009 and 2019, which is when the survey was distributed. And so here we have the results of that, okay? And we had about, in terms of the specific college sector, we had an N of just a little bit over 1,200, I believe it was 1,243, okay? But here we've got the responses to this. And so we can see that you know, that just over 50% of the people who responded said that between 2009 and 2019, that things had gotten better in terms of Title IX enforcement. And then another significant portion, just below 35%, effectively said, you know, nothing's changed for us. Whatever our Title IX enforcement is, that's we're holding steady at whatever that is. And then there were very few reports that things had gotten worse. Okay, but of course, when we asked the question, one of the things that we knew is that even as we asked this qualitative assessment, that that because the Title IX compliance has not been particularly level, meaning that experts have been inclined to note that colleges and universities have not had a strong history of compliance, that hearing that things had gotten better did not necessarily mean that Title IX compliance had actually been achieved. Okay, and so what we took this response to mean is that that there was more conversation around it, that there were greater efforts to get into compliance, but this certainly should not be read as any kind of an indicator that schools were in compliance. Okay, but then we did kind of, you know, hit this interesting sort of next response because, you know, we did also ask our respondents to rate the degree to which colleges comply with Title IX in the area of athletics. So we went a step further and, you know, we didn't say, well, you know, what's your enforcement record like? And then, you know, just tell us the degree to which you think that your school is complying. And we use the scale of, you know, do you have a strong record of compliance, very strong record? Is it a weak record, very weak record? What does that look like? And, you know, here we had over 40% saying that they had very strong records of compliance. Okay. And then in the weak area, you know, it was falling more within that 30 to 40% range. And then we had folks in the middle, just under 25%, who were saying that it was neither strong nor weak. So that kind of, you know, that assessment really struck me a little bit, because I was kind of like that rating of being strong or very strong seemed to be actually a little bit more than what I might have expected. Okay, but and you know, I wasn't disappointed by that, but I was just interested in it. And then we have this response where we asked our survey respondents to give us a sense of where they thought their athletic departments were at in terms of treating men and women equitably within their departments. And 43% thought that men and women were being treated equitably. And then more than 56% believed that men received better treatment than women in their athletic departments. So we're piecing all of that together, and you know, and we were putting it up against. We were putting those responses up against what the data had indicated to us. Okay, and for those of you who work with in the area of Title IX and with EADA data, you know, we need to put a red blinking light on the fact that I think all of us understand that the EADA data is just one data set. And that it expressly says that that it is not a specific measure of Title IX compliance. Okay, I think we all can understand that. At the same time, though, as much as and I should connect that to the fact for maybe some of you who don't understand this as much, that Title IX is very specific to each institution, and compliance is determined on a one-to-one basis. and largely because of the fact that Title IX is such a flexible law. It provides so many different ways that you can comply and so many different ways that you can explain why your compliance picture looks the way that it does, okay? So from that standpoint, we do have to be cautious in terms of the way that we read EADA data. Having said that, though, what we can kind of observe about the data is that when we look at it in broad strokes, when we look at what's happening across whole divisions, Division One FBS, Division One FCS, or Division One overall, Division Two or Three, that there are some indications of things that raise really, really big questions about what's actually happening on the ground, because no matter how you cut the data, they just should not look the way that they do. Okay, if if there is a strong compliance to the law, all right, and I think one of the places where you can really look at and kind of assess this with some degree of confidence is in the area of allocation of athletic scholarships, okay? Because if you look at the third bullet point here, only 35% of NCAA Division I athletic programs reported being in compliance in 2017-2018 in terms of the allocation of athletic scholarships. The athletic scholarship analysis is one of the most specific analyses that we can do because the regulations require that the allocation, if you've got 50% of your female athletes in the total athlete pool, there's an expectation that your athletic scholarship allocation is going to be within 1 point of that percentage, okay? And there are a couple of reasons why those percentages might fluctuate, but you shouldn't see vast disconnections between what that percentage of representation is for female athletes and what the allocation of athletic scholarships is. And year in and year out, what we find over a 10-year span of time is we find patterns like this, where school after school after school is not within that 1% range, okay? So what that, when people will draw the conclusion that the vast majority of schools are not in compliance with Title IX, we begin to understand this picture a little bit more in terms of why they can make an assertion like that. And I want to just say that all of this is context in relationship to the responses that we got from those women's sport leaders, and I'll tie that in as I continue to go through this analysis. But you know, a report that was issued in 2020, in the summer, late summer of 2020, was done by Nancy Hogshead-Makar and one of her research assistants. And what they did was they looked at every single school, the college and university that received federal funds in the EADA database. And so that end was 2,072 colleges and universities. It included schools from two-year institutions, community colleges, all the way through to major Research I institutions. And what they found is they found not only were there issues in the area of athletic scholarship allocation, but issues associated with proportionality, issues associated with allocations in terms of recruiting, issues associated with other operational areas, to the tune of to the tune of about less than 10% of all schools receiving what their method led them to believe was a passing grade in terms of compliance. Okay, and one of the things which interested me about this study that Hogshead-Makar did was with the Chasing Equity report. The study that we did, we found similar trends in terms of proportionality, in terms of recruiting, in terms of operational areas. So, the fact that that our data was aligning so strongly really really creates a context for us. And if we go back, for example, to those women's sport leaders who worked in the college setting, who were saying that their schools had uh, strong records of compliance. This would really suggest that that's not true. That even though the 43% or it's around 43% who thought that they had a strong record of compliance, that really is not being reflected in this data at all, or these data at all. Okay. Um, and it also then begs the question in terms of if there has been some improvement in terms of Title IX compliance, then what does that really mean? And at some level, one of the things that happened in 2011, we see a report being issued by the NCAA urging athletic departments to specifically, athletic departments and institutions to specifically appoint Title IX athletics compliance deputies within athletic departments. And so I think part of what's going on with the responses to the improvements that were happening between 2009 and 2019 relative to Title IX enforcement is that there was a period where we saw more people within athletic departments specifically being designated to have some responsibility in terms of Title IX compliance. But what we also see in this picture is that even with the appointing of those individuals, that does not translate into Title IX compliance. Okay, so we've got all of those dynamics going on that are incredibly fascinating to me, and I may have just bored you to tears with all of that, but I find the inner workings of this to be important and interesting. And I'm going to layer a couple more things onto this, just sort of out of fascination, and then eventually I'm going to tie it into some current cases. Okay. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about the Hogshead Makehart data, with the way that they did it, because they aligned schools. When we had done our work, we had looked at divisions separately. When she put all of the Penn State schools together, I just thought that it was a fascinating look at what was happening across the entire Penn State system. And keep in mind that less than 10% of all schools got a passing grade according to her methodology. And here we have a system where a good many of those schools, all of them at the Division III level, I might add. So for those of you who are familiar with Penn State, Abington, Berks, oh my gosh, Erie, you'll appreciate kind of what's going on with all of these citation to Penn State schools. But there does seem to be something going on with the Penn State schools, because even though they've got failing grades, and even though Penn State main campus, their big time football playing institution, received a failing grade, they received more passing grades as a unit than any other system that we see in the entire data set. And I looked at that a little bit just in terms of their leadership, and there are some interesting things that are going on there. And of course, for those of you who've followed compliance issues, it's particularly interesting to look at Penn State because of the penalties that were assessed to them following the quote unquote scandal surrounding Jerry Sandusky, the child predator, in 2011 and 2012. Because one of the things that the NCAA required Penn State to do was to appoint what was referred to as an athletics integrity officer. And then they were also required to issue reports on an annual basis about what they were doing in the compliance area, to address any number of compliance shortfalls. this is very controversial from the standpoint that the report that they used to lead to a decision around the athletics integrity officer was the Free report. Some of you might be aware of the controversy around that report. Having said that, for this particular picture, to see the additional emphasis on compliance at Penn State and the additional investment in personnel at Penn State with not only just the appointment of an athletics integrity officer, but a continuing appointment an athletics integrity officer. It's very, very interesting, especially because Main campus continues to get a failing grade. And within their overall structure, one of the things that they did was they took athletics compliance outside of athletics and put it under their university athletics compliance and risk management areas. Okay, but one of the things that I learned in looking at a little bit more is while they have an athletics integrity compliance officer for the main campus, that for the other Commonwealth schools, as they call them, they actually have another person who actually oversees that. And so I'm just wondering if somehow there's some kind of a different effect that's going on because we've got a person who's serving in this Commonwealth role who's overseeing all their Division III programs, and they seem to be trending in the direction of greater compliance. And then even with this incredible investment in compliance over the span of 10 years in the Division I school, that there are still substantial issues with their Title IX compliance picture. So I just thought that that was very, very interesting as almost as a sidebar issue. In terms of steps that women's sport leaders would recommend in order to achieve Title IX compliance. In the survey, what we did was we listed 10 different things that our expert panelists wanted to hear from in terms of the thoughts of women college sport leaders about steps that could be taken. And there were some really interesting dynamics within this list of 10, okay? Because one can argue that that all of the steps that were listed were things that should be done and frankly should have been getting done from 1972 to the present. But the top three things that they identified were linking Title IX compliance as a condition of membership in a sport governing body. And then the second one was requiring that there be a third party entity that would conduct an ongoing Title IX and gender equity assessment every 3 to 5 years. And then for the third one, that there would be Title IX compliance as a condition for championship eligibility. You know, we're in the middle of March right now. What it would mean is that that a team that would otherwise be selected for March Madness would not be permitted to compete in the tournament if they did not have, if they were not Title IX compliant. So this is very interesting that, you know, that where the women's sport leaders went was in the area of trying to create penalties within the governance structure to require Title IX compliance and to do so through probably through attestations, okay, which is really interesting because, for example, in order to comply with the requirements of the federal government for institutions that are receiving federal financial assistance, that they're already required to provide those attestations. That if you have faculty members who are receiving federal grants, if you are receiving federal funding through federal work-study programs, if your students are receiving federal funds in order to complete school, and your financial aid office is distributing and allocating those funds, and you know, if you've got projects on campus, capital projects, and you're receiving, you've purchased federal bonds, all of those kinds of things connect the dots in terms of the requirement around federal funding. So schools are required to indicate that across the spectrum of all of the different federal laws that they're expected to comply with, that they provide an attestation every year that they are in fact complying. So it raises a question for me in terms of what this additional layer may actually do, that if we already have all of these compliance mechanisms in place, then what is this additional thing going to do? So that's just kind of one question for me. In terms of the second bullet point, this thing about bringing in a third party to conduct Title IX and gender equity assessments, I would invite some of you to read an article by my gosh, our good friend Daniel Libet and his colleague Luke. Last fall, they wrote an article, and one of the things that they got into was their college and universities' approaches to compliance. And there was this very interesting exchange with a Title IX consultant where she spoke quite candidly about the fact that schools want to engage with Title IX consultants to help them with their PR efforts. That there are distinctions between trying to do something in the compliance area that will appease public opinion, and that if you look behind the curtain, that whatever action may or may not have been done doesn't actually lead to compliance. And we've actually seen this in the history of Title IX compliance. Schools that have cut men's sports, for example, and Title IX has been blamed for those cuts. And then when you look at the financial dynamic, 5 years out, you find that whatever savings might have been realized, that more often than not, women did not gain anything after those cuts occurred, that those dollars got reallocated back into men's sports, for example. So I think, we should just understand kind of that whole dynamic around third-party conduct. And this isn't to besmirch the reputation of all Title IX consultants by any stretch of the imagination, because it's the institution's commission that drives that. Okay, it's the institution's charge to the consultant to achieve a certain end. So if there's going to be manipulation, then that's going to be coming from the institutional side of things. So anyway, so we get into interesting territory, kind of talking about each one of these particular steps, and then the ones that came up a little bit lower on the list. This one about repeat offenders, meaning that schools that have been non-compliant for many, many years or have been repeatedly taken to court by their athletes because of non-compliance, that there was a strong feeling that the federal government had been far too lenient over the first 50 years of Title IX's existence in terms of really penalizing schools the way that the federal government has the capacity to do. The federal government has never removed federal funding from an institution for lack of compliance with Title IX, even though they have the capability to do that. So this was an item that came up more strongly than what it has historically come up before. And then lower down on the list was requiring educational training, which is a foundational piece of what schools are supposed to have been doing, which was a requirement from 1978 to the present. And then also monitoring Title IX gender equity through internal committees, that in one way, shape, or form, schools have always been required to have some kind of a regular monitoring system, because they're held accountable for the assessment that they provide. So it was interesting to me that those two actually came in lower than what I thought they would. And this could be because of the fact that they're supposed to be doing it anyway. But I did find it interesting in terms of how these sorted out. Um, Now, I want to take all of this and kind of take all of this big conversation about what is and isn't happening around compliance and what our perceptions around compliance are. And I want to kind of tie that into some cases that have emerged over the past year. As I record this, all of us are coming up on the anniversary of when our institutions probably went to fully online virtual classrooms, for example, back in March of last year. Here we have the University of Iowa, who cut 5 different teams just a couple of months ago. There were when they already had a pattern of non-compliance, and not only had a pattern of non-compliance, but has also paid out millions and millions of dollars to plaintiffs who have been able to establish in court that they experienced sex discrimination by the athletics administration at the University of Iowa. And this would be a school that would fall into that category of a repeat offender. But we have but what I also think is interesting about this case is that we have athletes who are so committed to this case that they put up a $360,000 bond to ensure that the case is going to go forward, whether the case goes beyond the time that they graduate. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see what happens in this particular case. But it fits within a group of cases where, as COVID hit and as athletic departments started to deal with stress, the way that institutions in general have been dealing with the stress of an economic downturn with the loss of revenue relative to our ability to do business, that athletic departments have also suffered, as we now well know. But one of the patterns here, which is a consistent pattern over time, is that women's sport is in a precarious position to begin with. And then when institutions begin to make cuts, there is either a disparate impact on women's sports, meaning that there's an amplified impact because they're already in a precarious position to begin with, more so compared to to men's sports. And then schools may already have not been meeting Title IX standards, so that when they made those cuts, they actually exaggerated whatever shortfall they had in terms of Title IX compliance. But then we have this layer of language that comes out of Dartmouth just recently, where Dartmouth had attempted to cut sports back in July. And then over a span of time, and another lawyer got involved, and there was $100,000 investment that Dartmouth, and $100,000 that Dartmouth had to pay to the plaintiff's attorneys to settle this case. But take a look at the language here. This is coming from President Hanlon at Dartmouth, and he says, to determine which teams would be eliminated, Director of Athletics Harry Sheehy and his team established a series of factors and considerations to be used in their assessment. We have recently learned that elements of the data that athletics used to confirm continued Title IX compliance may not have been complete. Okay, well, this raises all kinds of questions about what's going on there. And so are we facing a situation where an entire team, okay, not just the athletic director, but their entire leadership team, which would include their athletics compliance people. It would include whoever their Title IX people are on campus, that entire team did not come up with the right data in order to make the decisions that they did. So what are we really confronted with here? You know, is this just a PR statement? Is it really a statement about people still not taking Title IX seriously enough that they actually learn what the expectations are? What does this say about all of their previous reviews? If the team got this wrong, then what's been happening over the entire span of time that they've been in leadership? And frankly, you know, I hesitate to kind of hold out one institution on this front, but the plain fact of the matter is that the data has been telling us this for many, many years, okay? And this just kind of um, uh, puts it in sharp focus, I guess. Um, and then, of course, we've had cutting attempts to cut other teams and other women's teams at a number of other institutions. And over and over again, those cuts were reversed when schools were, when the threat of a lawsuit occurred, or when when the situation came into the public domain, okay? And so, I'll let you just ruminate about that and think about that. I did find this news item from just, you know, February, really right on point in terms of really making sure that you comply with Title IX. And one of the threads of this that I've been thinking about is a couple of conversations I've had with some of my students, primarily at the graduate level, but some of my students who work in athletic departments where there was early on in COVID, in March and April of last year, there was an underlying thread going through athletic departments that somehow they thought that they did not need to comply, number one. And number two, that because of the financial circumstances, that they could simply ignore Title IX. And for those of us who are familiar with the requirements of Title IX, Title IX does not go away in terms of the circumstances. The argument that you can't afford to be in compliance with Title IX is just not acceptable. Because the logic is that you are discriminating because of the fact that you can't afford to do otherwise. And that simply is not, it's not an acceptable argument, okay? And then in terms of somehow an emergency situation triggering noncompliance, that just simply, I mean, you can't pick and choose which laws you're going to abide by when there is an emergency. You know, all of those things need to be vetted through legal counsel. You know, you can't assume that that's the case, and you can't assume it on a selective basis. And if the one law, you know, if you're you know, if you think for a second about FERPA, about HIPAA, about other federal requirements, legal laws that apply to your athletic department, if you're making every effort to comply with HIPAA and FERPA, and then somehow you say, well, today I'm not going to comply with Title IX, that just adds to the problem, okay? So that's probably way more than what we need to get into, but it's a very interesting part of this. What I will invite you to read, because it's a really, really interesting analysis, and I think timely, interesting, and important. And it's this piece by Swanson and Smith, where they do an excellent job of going through background from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then into the aughts, really talking about the dynamic of how cuts were made in each of these eras. And in the 1990s, for example, those of us who remember this, There was a financial downturn at that point in time, where schools were routinely cutting women's sports. And Brown University, for example, we had Cohen v. Brown that came out of that era. And when we look across all of those eras, we see similar dynamics going on around athletic departments and their relationships with Title IX. And Swanson and Smith do a really nice job of setting the clock, so to speak, on the dynamics of what happened in the aftermath of COVID. And of course, one of the most powerful things that they do in the article, frankly, is in the very first line, where they say 30 days after the pandemic was declared, schools were already cutting sports. So I think it's a terrific follow-up to what we've talked about here. Now I'm going to wrap things up. I'm sure that I'm longer than what all of you expected me to be. I just thought this image was really, really interesting as maybe a takeaway and an important signal. This is an image from the Connecticut College website, and this is a very rare image. You really don't see kind of, a promotional effort to draw people's attention to the EADA. Generally, what schools are doing is they do have to comply with creating links to some kind of information about the EADA. And oftentimes those links will take people back to the federal cutting tool. But here, we've got this incredible image, which really is an inviting one, and sort of advertises the EADA. Some of our takeaways are what they always are, but 50 years out, it's kind of amazing that the takeaways are still the same. We still have people working in athletic departments that don't know what Title IX requires, and that should change. We have schools that still are not being held accountable. That should change. We have, because of the lack of education, we have perceptions even among women's sport leaders where their perceptions are different than what's actually happening on the ground, and they're more favorable than what's actually happening on the ground. So I'll leave you with all of those kinds of things. And if any of you have an interest in this, please email me and Nick. And I want to thank Nick again. He's just a tremendous partner and a tremendous colleague. And especially with this being at University of South Carolina, his home institution, I want to make sure to give him all the praise that he deserves. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I hope you have a good CSRI.